I had been staring at my laptop screen for a while, pretending to focus on the quarterly report, but my mind wasn't anywhere near numbers or graphs. It was the ping from my phone that froze me, a notification from a messaging app one didn't usually check. My thumb hovered over the screen, and a knot tightened in my stomach before I even opened it. It was a message from Claire, my wife's coworker. I didn't know why she had my number. The words were innocuous at first, a casual "Hey, can't wait to see you tonight," but something in my chest screamed alarm. I opened her profile to see a smiling photo of her leaning over my wife at some office event. Something clicked, and I felt the world tilt on its axis. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just flirtatious office humor? I told myself, probably nothing, but the pit in my stomach wouldn't go away. I didn't sleep that night. I replayed every detail of the last few months. Claire coming over to discuss a project, my wife taking late meetings at the office, the extra hours she never mentioned. By Thursday, the unease became unbearable. I started leaving subtle notes on her desk, nothing obvious, just reminders that I knew she worked late. And then I saw them. The receipts. A dinner for two at that new Italian place downtown. The name on the receipt wasn't mine. And suddenly, it wasn't just a gnawing suspicion. It was concrete proof that I didn't confront her right away. I needed to breathe. I needed to plan. Because anger alone wouldn't satisfy me. Revenge had to be precise. I watched her that Friday as she left for the office. The sun hit her hair, and a part of me wanted to call out, expose everything right there on the street. But another part of me, the part that had learned to calculate and wait, told me to hold back. I decided to follow her. Discreetly, of course. She got into her car, a nondescript gray sedan, and drove to the back of the office complex, a place I didn't even know existed. I parked a few blocks away and watched from behind the darkened glass of a coffee shop, pretending to sip a latte. And then I saw him, Martin, the coworker, waiting for her near the employee entrance. They didn't just shake hands. Their body language screamed intimacy, a lingering touch, a shared smile that belonged only to them. My hands tightened around the cup. My heart pounded, but underneath it all, a strange clarity settled in. I had what I needed now, their routine, their patterns. If I was going to get justice, I needed to understand every step they took, every secret they believed was hidden. By the time they disappeared inside the building, I had already formed the first part of my plan. Revenge wasn't just an emotional impulse. It was strategy. And if I played it right, they wouldn't even know what hit them until it was too late. I left the coffee shop that day without a word to anyone. But a storm had begun to form in my mind. It wasn't just about exposing them. It was about reclaiming control, about making them feel the same betrayal I felt, but with a precision that would leave no room for excuses or denials. The game had started, and I was determined to win. I told myself I would be surgical about it, precise, unemotional. That was the mantra I repeated every time the image of Claire's message flickered across my mind. Anger was useless unless it came with a map. So I built one. First, I made the obvious moves everyone thinks of but never executes. I cataloged receipts, timestamps, messages, the photo from my phone, the one I'd taken from the coffee shop when they stepped into the building. I photographed the parking lot, the employee entrance, the little cafe across the street where they met on Wednesdays. I printed them, stacked them, labeled them like evidence in a case file. The physicality of it steadied me. Seeing paper in my hands made the betrayal feel less like a lurching animal and more like a problem I could solve. Then I learned their patterns. Martin and my wife had routines, the midday calls, the late-night sign-offs on the team chat, the Thursday strategy dinners. I sat in my car across from the office for an entire Thursday and watched them leave together like two conspirators in a movie I no longer wanted to watch. I took notes, timid at first, then meticulous. If they thought they'd hidden everything behind closed doors and password-protected calendars, they were wrong. People leave footprints. I just had to look in the right places that I didn't want to see. I wanted irreproachable proof, and then leverage that would make a confrontation unnecessary. So I targeted the thing both of them cared about most after secrecy, their reputations at work. If they were careless enough to put what they had at risk inside the office, then the office could be the blade I used, not with breakage or violence, but with policy, optics, and consequences. My first operational move was to learn the company's rules. HR at big firms tends to be a guidebook of do's and don'ts, conflict of interest forms, and clauses about fraternization. I read the employee handbook online late at night, my kitchen light on, the house silent. There it was in black and white. Undisclosed intimate relationships between coworkers that create conflicts on assigned accounts must be reported. If you're on the same client team, you must disclose. If you don't, it's at best a disciplinary matter, at worst grounds for termination. Knowing that felt like finding a fuse to pull. I didn't go to HR right away. That would be clumsy. Instead, I compiled the dossier, photographs, receipts, a timeline cross-referenced with project deliverables on which Martin and Claire worked together. I included screenshots of messages I'd found on my wife's tablet when she left it on the couch. Nothing that required illegal access. I only documented what was openly visible when she left the device unlocked. Everything in the packet could be explained away as found rather than stolen. That choice mattered to me because I didn't want to be the kind of man who stooped to trespass. I wanted to be the kind who used the rules everyone else agreed to live by. Then I tested a smaller lever: gossip. Not the kind shouted at a bar, but quiet, precise social proof. I messaged an old college acquaintance who'd taken a middle management job in the same company. A woman named Denise who still liked a good scandal but appreciated careful wording. I didn't reveal names. I simply described a pattern I'd observed, offered the nonchalant question of whether undisclosed relationships between team members were still frowned upon. Denise replied with protocol and, in a later text, an offhand remark about a rumor. Casual, not incriminating. I felt the pull of a network forming. Rumor, policy, then action. The night I decided to act, I sat on the kitchen floor of the house we'd bought together, the open packet at my feet like a map of everything I'd lost. I didn't call my wife. I didn't yell. I wrote an email to HR that was dry and professional, the kind of correspondence you might expect from someone concerned about compliance. I attached the dossier and followed it with a simple statement. I was not asking for punishment. I was asking for an impartial review of potential conflicts of interest. I didn't sign it with my name. I used an anonymous email route I'd set up with a temporary account, and I used the office's anonymous reporting portal. I told myself anonymity was a tool, not a cowardice. Dropping that packet into the corporate machine felt like the first real cut of the operation. It sent a ripple through systems designed to be efficient. A case number, an HR intake specialist with a bland subject line, a meeting scheduled. The next day I watched, detached, as my wife's expression changed when she checked her phone at breakfast. She tried to look casual, to tuck the shadow of worry into the corner of her smile, but I saw it. I kept my face blank and concentrated on my coffee. The waiting after that first move was the hardest part. It's one thing to be busy planning and another to let other mechanisms, bureaucracy, rumor, fear of exposure, do their work that I couldn't, however, rely only on bureaucracy. People are good at plausible deniability. So I took a second tack, exposure where it mattered most. Martin had something I could use that mattered more than his job title: a family. I found a photograph on a community page of his son's soccer team. The image included Martin and what looked like his wife on the sidelines. A public comment thread referenced Martin's name and a local PDA account. Small-town visibility, even for a man who worked in a corporate glass tower, was its own vulnerability. That I wrote one careful private message to Martin's wife. The message was clinical, devoid of accusation. I'm reaching out because I believe there may be something you should know that could affect your family and company name as clients. I'd prefer to speak directly. I didn't give details. I wanted curiosity to pull her in, not anger to push her away. 10 minutes later, an unusual typing indicator appeared on my screen as she responded. "Who is this?" That single line felt like an engine starting. When she agreed to meet, I saw the collapse of composure on Martin's public profile. He canceled a meeting that afternoon for a family emergency. I didn't celebrate. I watched with the solemnity of someone observing a slow-motion accident. I met Martin's wife in a small diner 2 towns over coffee that went cold between us while she listened and then cried and then laughed in a way that was more disbelief than humor. She asked questions I had no moral right to answer, and I chose to be sparing with facts, offering only what I thought she needed to know to start asking the right questions at home. There was a point during that meeting when I felt myself crossing a line, not because of anything I'd done, but because of the intent that hummed between us. Revenge wasn't supposed to be about causing collateral implosion, but there's always an orbit of damage when you start pulling at threads. Her face was streaked with mascara, her voice cracked, and she told me something I hadn't expected. Martin had been charming, generous, deeply committed to their son. I realized then that I wasn't only destroying a man I hated in that moment. I was opening a door that could hurt an innocent kid. The calculator in me asked whether the cost was acceptable. The part of me that still remembered how I'd held my wife when we first moved into this house balked. This misgiving slowed me, not stopped me. I didn't want a wreck. I wanted a correction, a recalibration. So I added a final move that felt, if not merciful, then proportional. I drafted a letter to my wife. Not an accusation, but a set of choices laid out, resources she could use, an invitation to talk, and the warning that if the patterns continued, I would not hesitate to take the dossier to her supervisor with my real name attached. I left it on the kitchen counter, folded inside the newspaper where anyone might find it. I wanted her to choose. I wanted to remove the theater of surprise and give her a chance to step away. That night, before she came home, I sat in the dark and listened to the house breathe. I thought of the first time we bought this table together, the bolt of joy at choosing the right would finish, the silly argument over a lamp. I thought of how small betrayals sometimes start as innocent compromises, how office flirtation can curdle into an affair without the people involved looking up to realize they're drowning. There was love in my memory, not enough to paper over the present, perhaps, but enough to make me careful with the ways I broke things. When she walked through the door, she didn't look like a woman caught. She looked like someone who had been waiting for something to happen and finally saw it. She picked up the paper, unfolded the letter, and her fingers skittered at the final line where I signed my name in ink instead of the anonymous email I'd used to tip HR. She met my eyes then, not with the defiance I'd expected, but with a raw, stunned plea. "Why?" she said softly, and the word required no elaboration. I could have started with fury. I could have hurled evidence at her like stones. Instead, I told her the truth that had been the engine of every move I'd made. Because I wanted you to have a choice. My voice sounded foreign in my own ears. It was the voice of a man who still believed in the possibility of decency, even as he planned revenge. For a second, I saw her as she must have once seen me, not the architect of a plan, but a man who could be hurt. She didn't confess. She didn't deny. She asked for time, and I gave her 3 days with conditions. No contact with Martin. Full transparency about her calendar. If she complied, I promised nothing more than my decision would hinge on evidence and not on vengeance. If she didn't, if the pattern continued, I told her I would go to her supervisor and to Martin's wife and let the corporate engine run its course. Leaving her in the living room that night, I felt the pivot under my feet. The plan had been initiated. The ripples had begun to spread. I had started with strategy and moved into human terrain, where plans meet unpredictability and where the smallest choices, a message, a meeting, a letter, can bend trajectories you thought fixed. What I couldn't predict, even with all my maps and timelines, was how the act of starting to hurt them would begin to hurt me back. The satisfaction of being right was immediate and cold. The longer arc of consequence was slower to show itself. I slept badly that night, haunted by the knowledge that revenge is a mirror. The more carefully you craft it, the more of yourself you might see reflected in the fragments. The first 3 days were an exercise in watching for fissures. I called in sick to work more than once under the pretense of a lingering cough, so I could be around the house and measure silence. She kept to her side of the agreement outwardly. No late client dinners, no unexplained messages. But agreements are thin things. Intent is thicker. I could feel the weight of the pause between us, that hesitance that lives where love used to be assumed. On the 4th day, she broke the conditions in the smallest possible way. A text at midnight from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "You up?" and the timestamp was 3 minutes after she'd said she was turning in. My fingers trembled when I traced the number back. It belonged to a burner service, one of those apps that makes people feel invisible. I could have called her out then and there, thrown the paper packet across the kitchen table, and watched her scramble. But instead I extracted the number, set it aside like another piece of evidence, and watched. What followed was the kind of patience you only discover when you have nothing left but the work of watching. I started to nudge their lives in subtle public ways. I emailed a recruiter I'd once worked with and asked about openings in Martin's region, not to get him fired, but to create a plausible disruption in his pattern. When his LinkedIn started pinging with messages, his smile at the office softened a hair. Attention from peers brightens people who need to feel seen. That I also began to seed doubt in smaller social channels. I shared a memory from a company holiday party on my private Facebook with a caption that nudged at boundaries. A joke about how work spouses make meetings harder to sit through. It was casual, almost laughable, but a couple of mutual friends in our network liked it and commented with emojis. In an office built on optics, a single like can be the first grain of sand that shifts a dune. The HR case moved slowly but surely. Anonymous reports force HR to look. HR's instinct is to avoid liability. They began with interviews, neutral in their wording, which never failed to feel like a scalpel under the skin. My wife grew guarded. She started deleting messages, not as haphazardly as before, but with a cleaner hand, which is to say she was thinking about preservation and appearance. That, more than anything, told me she understood the stakes. When she began to bring her laptop home and close it at the sight of me, I knew the current was moving. And then Martin made a mistake. It wasn't dramatic. It was a text to Claire meant to be casual, sent from his work account instead of a burner. The line read, "See you after the 3 p.m. client wrap, can't wait." He didn't blind copy, he didn't think, and he hit send from the corporate domain. It was the little human error that becomes the fulcrum for larger things. That message landed in the project thread and floated there like a wasp on honey until someone else noticed that I didn't need to be the one to point it out. The office did it for me. A junior associate who was dogged about protocol flagged the inconsistency to a manager, and in an hour a meeting was called where people avoided looking at each other and instead looked at notes. Martin's name came up with a muted tension. HR's later call to him was perfunctory, but heavy that I watched him the day they pulled him into a conference room. He came out with a paper cup of coffee and a face like someone who'd been sitting in a dentist's waiting room for bad news. He walked faster than usual, as if to outrun what waited at home. At the cafe across the street from the office, Claire sat alone with a to-go cup and a posture that said she was braced for impact. The rules I'd set in motion didn't need my hand on the wheel anymore. They were machine-like and impartial, which is what made them so effective. Revenge can be mundane in its mechanichood, but mechanisms have consequences. There's a particular cruelty to corporate discipline. It doesn't judge, it just executes policy, and policy doesn't care for kids or mortgages. When Martin's department was reassigned and his client accounts moved, his day-to-day life changed. He took home less worry about appearances and more worry about practicality. The uncomfortable truth sat in the middle of all this like a stone. I had started an administrative collapse that would ripple longer than any of us could control. At home, the cold had a new edge. She was quieter, speaking in fragments. We both pretended the house was full of ordinary noise, a dishwasher humming, a neighbor's lawnmower, but the silence was a living thing. She apologized once in a way that would have been easy to forgive if regret had been the currency she spent. Her apology was more like a curt bow, polite, distant, a concession made to keep the pieces from falling into chaos. I accepted it, or I let it appear I did, because my mission had shifted again, from discovery to consequence, from accusation to a reclamation of my life. There was, however, an unanticipated actor in the play, Claire herself. She was not the caricature of a homewrecker I'd imagined. I started to see pieces of her outside of the photographs and messages. A tired laugh in the hallway when she dropped off papers at our shared printer. A careful curiosity when she lingered at the biggest window in the office to read the morning's headlines. She had a son with a lacrosse stick and a weekend ritual of driving out past the river to watch him practice. She was, in short, a person. The simplicity of that fact made the calculus of revenge heavier. You don't always target the whole person. Sometimes you target a faceless idea, and rarity of human texture remains. The night Martin called his wife and told her everything. The emails, the missed meetings, the way HR had been circling. I listened from the other side of a door, not because I wanted to eavesdrop, but because I was involuntarily present in their shared consequence. Martin's voice was raw. His wife's was a mixture of shame and fury that landed in my kitchen like a thrown plate. I felt, in a sudden lurch, the taste of retribution that wasn't satisfying anymore. It had cost me things I hadn't accounted for. The comfortable illusion of being a good man, the ease of laughter over dinner, The small domestic mercies we take as proof we're okay that I couldn't turn the mechanism off. Once the corporate engine started, it ran on its own momentum. My role shrank from instigator to spectator, and the view was uglier than the act. In those small human wreckages, the canceled weekend with family, Martin's embarrassed silence at a PDA function, Claire's attempts to avoid eye contact in the corridor, I saw the long tail of my actions. The moral arithmetic became complicated. Was I punishing a betrayal, or was I removing people's ability to be forgiven in private? The question made sleep scarce, but the human heart is a capricious judge. The more I watched, the less certain I became that the right move was to push everything into daylight. There is a strange mercy in letting people fail and find a way back on their own terms. There is also a ruthless practicality in holding them accountable where their choices had consequences. I was living in the limbo between those two philosophies, and it felt like balancing on a wire above a city that had once been full of light. And then she did something I didn't expect. Claire's husband, the man who'd been a peripheral name in my dossier, resigned. Not fired, not reassigned, but he walked away from a job he loved, telling his wife it was time to be home for their son. Martin's public fallout became private when his notice appeared in the company newsletter, pursuing other interests. It read like a euphemism, but we both understood it meant he'd lost his anchor. Claire took leave, ostensibly to care for her child. It felt like the world was compressing, making room for something new, and I felt adrift that I thought I wanted them to hurt. What I hadn't prepared for was the aftermath of hurting them. The house felt like a ship with a compass broken. I had achieved the clarity of vengeance, but not the satisfaction I'd imagined. There was only the echo of a plan done well and a life that now required repair. When she came to me that night and said, "I don't know who I am," I didn't have a script. I had only the worn outline of a man who had wanted justice and now had to figure out whether justice and mercy could coexist. Days blurred into a polish of routine. Work, quiet dinners, displaced anger, attempts at normalcy. I had thought the hard part was executing the plan. The harder thing was what came after, reckoning with the hollow. I began to notice small swings in us, like a clock regaining power after its battery is replaced. She drove with more intent on the weekends, took our dog to the park, and let him chase frisbees until his tongue lolled out. I cleaned the garage and found tools I hadn't used since we moved in. These were domestic banalities, but they felt like life nudging towards some sort of repair. And yet, under the surface, other currents moved. Claire's absence from the office gave some colleagues room to breathe, to reassign accounts without feeling complicit, and that allowed certain pragmatic colleagues to approach me with neutral nods that used to carry suspicion. People like tidy outcomes, and they like to return to their rhythms once disorder passes. In offices everywhere, life prefers a return to the predictability of calendars and coffee orders. Then, unexpectedly, Claire reached out to me. Her message came on a gray Tuesday. It was a simple text, more human than I'd imagined she could be. "Do you have time to talk?" I stared at the phone for a long time. My thumb hovered over the button, then pulled away. I pictured her at her kitchen table with a stack of bills and a calendar smeared with overlapping parent-teacher nights and late-night conference calls. In those brief images, there was a woman shaped by small demands and the wish to be better at any of them. When we met, it was somewhere neutral. The library cafe near the river, tables spaced like islands so conversations could stay private. She smiled with a tired grace that acknowledged our shared pasts in a single fold of lips. She apologized not with jagged confession, but with a clarity that suggested she wanted to be understood rather than absolved. "I didn't set out to hurt you," she said. "We were careless. I'm so sorry." There were no theatrics, just a human admission of failure. I listened. It would have been easy to answer with recrimination, to list every grievance, to make her face the mirror of hurt I'd made for her. Instead, I asked questions I'd never thought to ask in the heat of the plan. What did she want now? How did she see herself? Her answers were small architecture, plans to find stable work closer to home, to go back to school for a certificate, to rebuild trust with her son. She asked about my wife, about whether she was okay. She asked whether I had been okay. It was an odd intimacy, two people who had collided privately and then returned to the public world to pick up pieces together. When I walked back to my car, the sun was low and the city felt less like a stage and more like a place where real people had difficult conversations. The world was not neatly divided between villains and victims. There were only people doing their best and sometimes failing spectacularly at home. Things altered in small, significant ways. My wife and I had a conversation that was more real than any we'd had since the dinner receipts. Not an argument or a bargaining session, but a slow reveal. We spoke about prior loneliness, the ways our marriage had allowed us to drift like parallel lines. She spoke about the way Martin had made her feel seen in a way that was painless. I spoke about the years I'd been tired, the nights I pretended not to notice. There was no absolution in that talk, just the labor of bearing witness to each other's isolation and error. I proposed we try something deliberately small, a weekly ritual that would include no screens and one question. Just one. We had to answer to each other. The first week, we asked about the last time each of us had felt truly proud. The conversation went sideways quickly, but in the mess of it we found laughter. That laughter felt less like a bomb and more like an instrument. The first tool to reconstruct a life, the corporate echo lessened. HR closed the case with a private memo that the matter had been addressed through internal channels. In the sanitized language of institutions, things were neat. Martin's profile faded in office chatter and was replaced by someone else's name. Claire's leave stretched, then contracted as she found part-time work tutoring. The machinery of consequence had done its work, but life, resilient and stubborn, kept moving. Yet the most surprising turn came when Martin's wife, the woman I'd met in the diner, reached out to me months later. She found me on social media with a careful message. "Thank you for telling me." It was not a line meant to court gratitude, but one of honest acknowledgement. She had separated from Martin briefly, taken their son, then reevaluated what they wanted. Their marriage didn't survive intact, but it didn't collapse into ruin either. They found a new arrangement that held their particular shapes. In that message, I felt something like closure, though it was not the tidy justice I had imagined. Real life makes compromises. My involvement had been a lever, not the whole solution. Time, which had once felt like a tool in my chest to be wielded when the moment was right, became the thing that taught me how fragile and stubborn human beings are. Years did not undo what had been done. Scars remained like topography on smooth skin. Sometimes, when the light hit the kitchen table a certain way, I saw the ghost of that packet of paper I'd spread out like a map. Other times, I'd catch my wife laughing at a neighbor's joke and feel a small burst of something like relief that we kept the ritual. We added small things, an old board game on Sunday afternoons, a walk where we tried to name 3 things we appreciated about the day. There were setbacks. She once lied about staying late to work, and I found a receipt in the glove compartment of her car. Dinner, 2 plates. We talked then, loudly and honestly. No one was spared the pain of reliving mistakes. Wounds reopened and healed. It was ugly and real, which meant it also had a chance at being durable. That I started to see what revenge had taken from me. Not the clean revenge I'd imagined, but my assumptions about being safe from heartbreak. I'd always thought of myself as a man who protected his life with facts and discipline. The plan I crafted confirmed those strengths, but also showed the limits of control. You can set rules and pull levers, but you can't set the moral weather in other people's hearts. Sometimes friends asked me whether I regretted it. The dossier, the anonymous email, the meeting at the diner. My answer evolved. At first I was defensive, a man who believed he had acted for truth. Later, my defense softened into complexity. I regretted the parts that caused pain to people who didn't deserve the full force of my campaign. The child whose weekend plans shifted, the husband who lost his job's routine, the wife who cried at a diner table. I did not regret standing up for myself, for demanding honesty, for refusing to let the betrayal be a private lie that eroded the bones of our marriage. Years on, the main thing that remained unexpected was gratitude, not from the people I'd targeted, but from myself. I had wanted to be a man who could respond to betrayal with integrity, and I had created a version of that, imperfect and costly. The process of this revenge taught me how fragile promises are and how important it is to guard the small, honest things. To tell someone when you are lonely, to say no to the easy chivalry of distraction, to choose each other in little acts that add up to a life. One late autumn afternoon, my wife and I sat on the front porch while the maple in the yard shed leaves in a slow, elegant surrender. Our dog nosed between our legs, old and content. She reached out and took my hand as if she needed it to remember I was there. We're different now, she said. We're not fixed, but we're trying. I squeezed her fingers. Trying is a verb, I said. It's something we do. She laughed, and it was warm. It didn't erase the past. It simply meant we'd elected to keep building. I had used rules and corporate policy as instruments of revenge. In doing so, I'd learned that consequences were necessary, but mercy and repair were what let a life continue after the collapse. There are no glamorous endings to this kind of war. There is only the slow domestic work of showing up. If I had to name the lesson, cruel, practical, human, it would be this. Revenge can deliver clarity and consequences, but it does not deliver peace. Peace is earned in the small acts that follow. The honest phone calls, the small apologies, the weekly questions without screens. That kind of work is the real architecture of a life worth keeping. And every so often, when no one was looking, I'd check the old folder on my desk, the one with the evidence I'd printed and filed away. The papers were yellowing at the edges, a small museum of a season I'd lived through. I didn't burn them. I kept them because they reminded me of the man I had been and the man I wanted to be. Not one who roared and demanded, but one who could take a stand without losing the tender capacity to return. Revenge had changed me. So had choosing to stay. The world moves in gradients, not conclusions. The story didn't end with a punishment or a neat redemption. It continued, messy and human, with two people who had been dishonest and who, by degrees and stubborn acts, tried to become honest enough to stay.